Chapter 6. The Good Earth. The Doctor and Sarah Jane stood outside. The TARDIS had been locked. A breeze was blowing from the west, and the sky was overcast. They could hear birds chirping in the trees. "We're on the north bank," the Doctor said. "I'll go right, you go left." Sarah Jane took one last look at the Doctor, nodded, and began walking. The Doctor took a step, halted, looked back at Sarah Jane, then turned and continued to the right. The path was barely large enough for a single person to get through. On either side, grass, vines, and trees made a living wall. Their job, the Doctor realized, was to direct traffic. Eventually, he found a pavement and then a part of London that appeared untouched by the invasion. There were no cars, but he saw a few drove horse-drawn carts as well as pedestrians. The Doctor received a few glances, but almost immediately they looked away. No one wanted to know. Most people wore older clothing. The few who wore newer clothes appeared as if they were in 18th century fancy dress, but without a sense of fashion. The Doctor surmised that clothing was expensive again, because everything had to be made by hand, using what raw materials the Crenoid provided. The Doctor crossed the road and walked along the embankment. Troughs filled with flowers, plants, and grasses had been set up along a ledge. The eyes and the ears of the Crenoid, the Doctor thought. Ahead of him was a young mother walking hand in hand with her young daughter. The Doctor was about to walk past them when the girl let go of her mother's hand and ran toward a large lily growing in one of the troughs. "No!" the mother screamed, running toward her child, but the daughter had already reached the lily as the neighboring plants extended their bodies to ensnare the girl's arms. The mother reached her just as the girl began screaming for help. Both struggled against the plants and pushed against the concrete, but the plants wouldn't let go. The Doctor looked around. No one was stopping to help. Quickly, he took the sonic screwdriver out of his pocket, changed the setting, and aimed it at the plants. After a short buzz, the plants let go, and the mother pulled her daughter toward her. She looked around and saw the Doctor, who stood there, pretending to be an innocent bystander, and guessed what had happened. The Doctor shook his head quickly and put a finger to his lips, then put away the sonic screwdriver again. The mother nodded curtly, set her daughter down again, and they began to jog away from the embankment. The Doctor wondered what the Green Police would have done if they had been here. Helped the girl? Helped the plants? "You there." The Doctor turned. "Speak of the revolution," he thought. A Green Police sergeant was making his way to him. The Doctor froze. Passers-by diverted their course to avoid them. "What just happened here?" the sergeant demanded as he approached the Doctor. "I'm not sure," the Doctor said. "I've never studied the life cycle of Aurelian hybrid lilies, but since it has full sun in a cool climate..." The sergeant scowled. "Let me see your pass." "It's in my coat," the Doctor said as he reached slowly into a jacket pocket. The sergeant put his hand on his taser and nodded. The Doctor slowly pulled out his psychic paper and held it out to the sergeant, who took it and read the contents out loud. "Dr. John W. Smith, Ph.D. in biophysics." "Pleased to meet you," the Doctor said. The sergeant looked up skeptically at the Doctor. "Is this your ID?" "Of course it is. I just gave it to you, didn't I?" "You talk back to me? You get 30 days, the sergeant said with a smirk. "Sorry, officer," said the Doctor with a pretense of humility. "So, you're a doctor, eh? Oxford or Cambridge?" "Cambridge, a colleague of Professor Chronotis." "Tell me about your last paper," the sergeant continued. "You are published, right?" "Of course," said the Doctor, nonplussed. It was about a light-time biomass response model for predicting the growth of choy sum in order to optimize efficient seedling production. The sergeant blinked for a moment and handed the psychic paper back to the Doctor. "Will you be in London long?" "Just long enough to visit a friend." The sergeant replied, "Don't overstay your welcome," and walked away. The Doctor sighed and turned toward the plants. The plants he had zapped seemed aware they had missed a meal, except for the lily, which appeared above it all. The Doctor resumed his walk. As he reached a light post, he suddenly felt a surge of energy pass through him. His knees buckled, and he threw himself at the pole to keep from falling. He slid down, but managed not to fall flat on his face. Then he staggered to his feet and forced himself to walk. "You knew this would happen," he muttered to himself. "Just put one foot in front of the—" Suddenly the ground rose to his face, and he realized he'd fallen. Thankfully, he'd landed on grass instead of concrete, and somehow he heard voices. Not human voices, the voices of plants, grass, thistles and vines, all asking, who was he? Should we remember him? Wasn't he the one that— Suddenly the doctor felt a man grab his arms. "Get up!" The doctor couldn't tell if he were under arrest or not, but he decided he'd have a better chance on his feet. But once he was up, he felt the world turning very quickly indeed. He almost fell again, but the man began dragging him away. "Come on," he hissed as he pulled the doctor forward. The doctor tried to work out which way he was going when the world suddenly went dark. Chapter 7. Blooming, but no longer lovely. Sarah Jane walked along a narrow path of packed earth. The trees and grasses pressed so tightly toward her that she wanted to break into a run. But she controlled herself and walked as calmly as she could. She heard insects in the tall grass and one or two birds up in the trees, but that was all. Then the path forked to the left and straight on. Turning left would mean turning away from the river against the doctor's instructions, and for some reason she had a feeling about the other path. Perhaps her instinct for a good story, she thought. She continued straight until she stepped out into a small area of London that she didn't recognize. There were shops, a number of pedestrians, 2 people walking their horses and 1 riding. A coffee shop had been closed down, its windows boarded up. A bookshop stood without a door, its contents confiscated or looted. A florist's shop down the road appeared to be open. A man was walking out with a bag of plant food. A florist shop in a world run by plants. A good first stop, she thought. Sarah Jane walked down the pavement, noting how those around her were studiously ignoring her. These people are terrified, she thought. The bell above the door rang as she walked in. A woman in her mid-50s with long grey and white hair stood behind the counter. She appeared to be more interested in her newspaper than her customer. Sarah Jane looked around. Packages of soil and plant food were stocked against one wall. The rest of the store contained potted plants and seed packets. There seemed to be no wrapping paper, vases, or balloons. Sarah Jane stepped toward the counter. "Excuse me." "Yes," the woman replied without looking up. "I'd like a dozen roses, please." Suddenly the woman turned to Sarah Jane with such fury that Sarah Jane instinctively took a step backward. "How dare you walk into my place and ask—" But the woman's expression changed again, this time into shock and astonishment. She braced herself against the counter to keep from falling. Suddenly, Sarah Jane recognized her. "Geeta," Sarah Jane whispered. Geeta looked thin and tired. She covered her mouth with her hand and then quickly moved out from behind the counter to wrap Sarah Jane in a massive hug. "We thought you were dead. They told us," Geeta continued. "Everyone said you were dead." Sarah Jane hugged her back, feeling as if she were back inside her dream. Geeta quickly released Sarah Jane, changed the sign on the front door to closed, locked the door, and dragged Sarah Jane into a back room. The room was packed with bags of fertilizer. Each window was covered by a thin drape. A sunbeam lit a small table in a corner, and in the sunlight stood an English rose in a ceramic pot. Geeta closed the door behind them. She took another look at Sarah Jane, hugged her again, then turned and opened a drawer. She pulled out a hip flask and took a nip. Without a word, she offered it to Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane shook her head, and Geeta replaced it in the drawer. "You haven't changed," Geeta said after a moment. But Geeta had. She looked so much older, so angry, frustrated and tired. Sarah Jane was about to ask what had happened to her when Geeta spoke. "We thought you were dead," she said for a second time. "Well," Sarah Jane began. "Rani told me," Geeta interrupted. Sarah Jane blanched. "When was this?" "The day Haresh," Geeta began, then stopped and shook her head. "Geeta," Sarah Jane finally asked, "what about Rani?" Geeta smiled a little. "Rani and Clyde lived together in a tower block guarded by them." Geeta pointed to the rose with her thumb. Really? Can we see them? Geeta suddenly gave Sarah Jane a look, as if she wasn't the person she had thought she was. How could you not know that? Geeta demanded. I came with the doctor. Geeta's eyes widened with surprise, then relief. Oh, Rani told me about him. She did? Yes, after they... Again she pointed to the rose. They won. No reason to hold back, I suppose. But why do you have the rose if... It's the law. 1 plant per room. That's how they listen. They listen? Well, not really. If something's going on, the plants get agitated. Then the green police come round. Except there's a wrinkle. Geeta broke out into a mischievous grin. What's that? The flowers don't like the crenoids. And with that, Geeta began laughing until there were tears in her eyes. As the laughter turned to tears, Sarah Jane helped Geeta take a seat. Sarah Jane retrieved the flask and offered it to Geeta. She took a long drink, emptying the flask. Tell me more, Sarah Jane continued. The flowers, they know we've bred them, fed them, kept them alive all these years. Yes, but we've also killed them to make bouquets or... Geeta shook her head. The flowers aren't like that. Maybe death is more like a dream to them. I don't know, she continued, looking more tired than ever. But they know we've done more to help them than any crenoid. So if you can, you put a rose or a lily or whatever in a room, and the flowers won't report you. Not unless there's a fire. Geeta smiled and patted Sarah Jane on the shoulder. Brilliant, eh? Then why were you so angry that I wanted a dozen roses? Bouquets can get you killed, and roses are only valuable to us alive. Geeta began to lean to the side, so Sarah Jane held Geeta steady for a moment. Can I get you anything? Sarah Jane asked. Geeta wiped her eyes, then nodded. Please, tell Rani I love her. You haven't seen her. Their tower block. It's a prison, guarded by vines that will let you in, but there's no way to tell if they'll let you out again. Can't you call them? Sarah Jane nodded toward the phone attached to the wall. Geeta shook her head. That's for calling the Green Police. They don't want us to organize. When was the last time you saw Rani? I shouted to her from the ground until I was warned to not come back. That was 3 years ago. 3 years! Sarah Jane repeated in astonishment. Geeta began crying softly again. Sarah Jane wrapped her in a hug and began thinking. Is there anything you can tell me about the day the crenoids took over? Sarah Jane asked. Geeta shook her head. It all happened so fast. The doctor had told her not to contact anyone in her past, but the first person she ran into was Geeta. Why? For what reason? Perhaps she could learn what she needed to learn elsewhere, but the best source would be Clyde and Rani. She looked at the rose on the table. It had turned toward the sun and had opened its petals. All right, she said finally. Geeta looked up at her. I'll go see Rani and Clyde.